So we now want to welcome in friend of the show, Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, to have this conversation with us. Joel, if you can, just for people who are not familiar, walk me through how these prisoner exchange negotiations go. How do they start? How do they decide which prisoners to choose?
Ashley, this is a great question because it's a very complicated process getting prisoners sprung from hotspot countries around the world. Russia, in this case, as we just saw with the release, North Korea, Iran. There have been hostages throughout the world in hard countries. Cuba as well comes to mind. What we have is a leader at the State Department, a presidential appointee, presidential envoy, who really engages across the entire U.S. government to figure out where the hostages are, because that's always important, and understanding then what the opportunities are for engaging those governments, what third parties may help. For instance, Bill Richardson, former cabinet secretary, often goes out and talks to foreign leaders, dictators around the world about these issues. This office engages the families and tries to pull together a picture of a potential deal that they could offer to spring Americans who are held captive by foreign governments and by foreign terrorist organizations as well, which is a really difficult, complicated process.
Yeah. And I wonder for this one in particular, how surprised are you that this was a successful negotiation at a time when, of course, tensions between the U.S. and Russia are so extremely high?
Yeah, this goes to the old adage of with diplomacy, one can walk and chew gum at the same time with an adversary, that there can be a hot war, a conflict, and also still other issues can be dealt with. During the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we, the United States, were arguing it out with the Soviets, having proxy wars around the world, and yet still engaging in nuclear negotiations to try to reduce the global threat from nuclear war. So this is a good sign in the sense that there can still be some diplomatic channels that advance our interests, and ultimately it's an American interest to get Americans back home. Right. So one shouldn't read too much into it in terms of diplomacy on the war with Ukraine, but it also does point to the ability of a government, our government in this case, and the Russian government, to still look at their interests from a very particular lens and deal with it and not have everything fall apart in front of them.
Yeah. And I think a natural question for people is if this does have any impact on the U.S.'s approach to the war in Ukraine. Is that what Russia is even hoping?
Yeah, I think what we're watching on diplomacy with Russia is very much like a game of testing, tests here, tests there, talking to Zelensky, not talking to Zelensky. There's conversations about, will May 9th be a day when Vladimir Putin declares victory of some sort and walks away? We still have an ambassador in Moscow, John Sullivan, who was a senior Trump official and is still the ambassador that President Biden has kept on. So there's still a recognition that this war is going to have to end with some type of an agreement at the table. Right now, our diplomacy is focused more on putting pressure on Russia to stop their aggression and supporting Ukraine to help them defend their territory. That's the diplomacy, the use of the State Department as a tool of national power. But there is this idea of talking to Russia and finding ways to do it. Confidence is not very strong right now. Possibly, hopefully, this humanitarian gesture could open a little bit of confidence. But again, there's a lot more that needs to be done by Vladimir Putin to fully restore confidence in his word.
So, Joel, I also wondered when this news came out what it means for the other United States citizens being held in Russia. Is this a good sign for them? You have Paul Whelan and Brittany Griner that are at least names out there that we know.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly a positive momentum for them. It sort of creates a dynamic that Americans believe it's possible to get these two individuals out, that maybe there is something else that the United States can trade. Maybe there are some other Russians in prison sitting here that are available that we clearly don't follow closely, but the special presidential envoy does. There's another country as well with Iran, where there are Americans being held hostage in Iranian prisons. And that's been a discussion that's been on the table in these nuclear negotiations with Iran. What about letting the Americans out? A lot of congressional interest and pressure. So it's certain that we're going to see more congressional interest, more public interest in this question, which does give President Biden some political space to cut deals, because he sees, and we all see, how incredibly important it is and popular it is to bring Americans home, and that's across party lines.
Yeah. And I have to say, for both of these cases, obviously Brittany Griner happening most recently, so that's the one people are maybe more familiar with. But it seems that there are a lack of developments and they're being handled fairly quietly. Is that, I mean, that's what I'm observing. But do you think that's on purpose?
When there's no news, sometimes it means there's good things happening behind the scenes. These are not diplomats who like the cameras. Our special presidential envoy is not going out there demanding that Russia release Brittany every day. If he did, it would undermine his ability to go engage the Russians and work through third parties and work with the families to really get a solution. So there's an ongoing process. In the case of Trevor, there was a process of the rule of law in Russia, as they call it, but they were going through a court proceeding with him. And we were keeping very mum, very quiet. This was not seen. This was not on the public radar screen, that is. And so then pop, here it is. And it's a great news. It's a great success story. Hopefully that's happening as well with Brittany and Mr. Whelan. And there are wheels turning about what options there are available to make trades, deals, or just frankly agreements directly about getting these people out.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I also, while you're here, Joel, just want to run through some other headlines out of Ukraine and Russia so we can discuss those. Russia has cut off gas for both Poland and Bulgaria, who refused to pay for the supplies in rubles. The European Union then stepped up and is supplying those countries with gas. But what exactly is the economic impact for both Europe and Russia here?
The economic impact is real. It's something that has been in the fear, in the headlights of fear amongst European officials for some time now. This idea that Russia can use its energy power to extort the European countries and put pressure on them to somehow weaken their support for Ukraine. That's not going to work. So it's good to see Europe stepping up, but it is going to cause more pain at the pump. It's going to cause more inflation and higher prices, and that's why we're seeing the release and have seen the release of oil by President Biden of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here, as well as significant ongoing international diplomacy to try to get other oil-producing countries to put more onto the market so that this kind of weapon that Russia wants to use to hurt the economies of its adversaries is wielded weak and inconsequential.
Yeah. And this one's interesting. Moscow sanctioned 287 British lawmakers, but notably not the prime minister. Many high-ranking U.S. officials have been sanctioned as well. Is this just for show, as most parliament members called it a badge of honor? Is this just kind of like for formalities? What is this exactly, and what is it not?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a little tit for tat. Maybe the Russians are saying, you can sanction us, we can sanction you back. Of course, Russians don't want to be sanctioned by the United States or Britain or the West and blocked from traveling there and have their assets and their oligarch yachts stolen. They don't like that at all. And I don't think that many American lawmakers or British lawmakers have any assets in Russia to worry about. So it really doesn't mean anything. Not sanctioning Boris Johnson, maybe that's because Vladimir Putin complained about how he was sanctioned and heads of state shouldn't be sanctioned. I'm not quite sure. But I don't think anybody in Britain is losing sleep about being sanctioned by a country where they don't have any money anyways.
Very well put. Joel Rubin, as always, thank you for coming here and sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure.